So welcome everyone to our last session, actually, of exploring the elements and interconnectedness of our local food system. And I'm Maria Pepitas with the University of Delaware Cooperative Extension, and with me as co-host today is Garey Hush, and she is with our organization as well and assisting in this program. And so today, as always, our objectives are really to help all of you better understand our local food system, be able to identify some of the opportunities that we might have to strengthen our food system, and figure out how you might become involved. This is the model that we've been using throughout our series that just shows the complexity, right, of our local food system. And each session we've kind of focused on a different area of this. And today we'll be talking kind of on this interesting overlap, right, about the environment, but also farming and in the kinds of farming that where we're talking about animals and grazing and kind of regenerative farming practices. And so I need to thank all of our co-sponsors, including our Departments of Agriculture in Delaware and Maryland, and our University of Maryland Eastern Shore Extension Program, and many other organizations, as you can see. And today I am really, really pleased to have Susan Garey here, who's going to be talking about grazing, food production, and the environment. And Susan is the Kent County Extension Director, and that's Kent County, Delaware. And she's an extension agent in animal science and is also the state 4-H animal science program coordinator. And as I said, she's with the University of Delaware Cooperative Extension. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Susan.
So I'm really pleased to be here today and to give this talk. I'm wearing a number of different hats here and kind of commingling all of them as we talk, but not only do I work for Extension as an animal science extension agent, meaning mostly large livestock and horses, but I'm also a farmer myself, raising a flock of small ruminants. We raise some corn and soybeans as well at home, and some cattle, mostly for consumption for us personally and for some immediate friends and family. We're on about 50 acres in Harrington and have slowly been converting cropland to pasture land. So we're about 37 acres in cropland now and about 10 acres of pasture. And that pasture, you'll see a number of photographs scattered throughout this presentation that are actually my personal photographs from home, as well as photographs from my Nuffield Scholarship time. So a Nuffield Scholarship is a scholarship that is given to explore, I call it experiential research. So explore a topic internationally, and then a paper is written at the end. My scholarship was interrupted by COVID, so I got partway through it and haven't been able to finish, but am looking to resume that travel in the next year. But my topic revolved around integrating grazing ruminants into cropping systems, looking at issues like soil health, water quality, animal health, and what we can do in terms of carbon sequestration, because there frankly are places in the world that are farther ahead of us on that topic than we are. So with that, I showed this to Jerry and Maria because when I was asked to give this talk, this is kind of where my brain went. What do I talk about? And how do I cover this in such a short amount of time with people that have such broad backgrounds and are coming from different places in terms of base knowledge and perspectives? And I did take a little bit of time to review some of my other previous speakers' presentations just to see what they had talked about. And you'll see some intersections between things that they've discussed and what I'm going to bring up today on a very surface level. We don't have the time to get into these topics too far in depth. But one of the questions that I came up with is, are grazing, food production, and the environment mutually exclusive topics? And I don't think so. And I hope by the end of this presentation that you don't think so as well. And we'll circle back to this question at the very end. But in preparing my talk, I did decide to kind of switch the order around a little bit to build my case, and also to, I like to end on the positive. So we'll get to the good stuff at the end. So let's start a little bit with food production. And here's a pretty typical picture of row crop agriculture, kind of what we think of in the United States as traditional ag. In Nuffield, we talk a lot about what we call wicked problems. So these are those big, enormous issues that don't have one single straightforward answer. They're very multifaceted. And so the big wicked problem that we are all facing, and that we talk about quite a bit in Nuffield, is how do we feed a growing global population in a sustainable manner? And that may look different depending on where you are on the globe. I think we all know at this point that our population on the globe is expected to exceed 10 billion people by the year 2060. And so what do we do? How do we address this issue? We're forecast about 100% increase in global crop demand between the years 2005 and 2050. And we need to raise overall food production around the globe about 70% of 70% increase during this same time period. So you can see this certainly fits the category of wicked problems. And we want to do this in a way that supports good environmental health and sustainability for the future in a multifaceted way. Sustainability has to be not just environmentally sustainable, but it needs to be socially sustainable. It needs to be economically sustainable. And so we need to consider all of those things. I think I would be remiss if I did not mention the UN SDGs. And I don't know if that I don't think that's been introduced yet in this series, but there is the 2030 agenda that the UNFAO has for sustainable development. So this was adopted by all UN member states in 2015, and really sort of provides a roadmap to, or a blueprint for, food security, for nutrition around the globe, hopefully for peace and prosperity, because we know that food security leads to more stable societies for people on the planet. And really these 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, are really at the core of this blueprint. And you will see that a lot of things that you've already been discussing in this series fit within these SDGs. And so they're applicable not only at the global level, but at the very local level. And I think they really relate also to our extension work as a whole. And so it's neat to see how even our Nuffield projects topics, most all of them fit into these SDGs. And I was first introduced to these SDGs when I had the opportunity to participate in Rome in the UN FAO's Committee on Food Security meeting in 2019. So I spent about a week and a half in Rome. We lived in an apartment that was a couple blocks from the UN, and traipsed off every morning to participate in a full day of meetings, both committee meetings as well as general listening sessions. And so it was very fascinating to see food security policy at that really high level. So I think we all know probably inherently the value of meat in nutrition, but I'm just going to review it very, very quickly. Meat is a very nutrient-dense food source. It is indispensable when it comes to providing things like proteins and fats, these indispensable amino acids, which are critical to human health and development. Really high in A and B vitamins, iron, and micronutrients like zinc, selenium, phosphorus, and copper. And I don't think that's news to anyone. But There's a new model that's been out just in the last year or two called the Delta model, and it's referenced in a number of scientific papers already at this point. And this Delta model is used to calculate the contribution of meat to the global availability of nutrients. And what the Delta model showed is that meat disproportionately contributes a higher level of nutrient density related to its overall mass, food mass on the globe. So I don't know if I explained that well, but it calculates per capita nutrient availability under conditions of equal distribution and identifies areas for nutrient deficiencies for various food systems. So it uses global food commodity data alongside demographic and nutrient requirement data from both the UN and the European Food Safety Authority. And it also has factors in nutrient bioavailability considerations for protein and some of these other nutrients that we just mentioned. It was published in the Journal of Nutrition in October of 2021, and its the bottom line is, the most important takeaway is that this Delta model strongly suggests that both plants and animal foods are necessary to achieve global nutrition. So there's your big takeaway from that scientific model. So let's move just a little bit to some environmental concerns related to meat production and livestock. And I don't think these are anything that you probably don't already have an awareness of or haven't already heard about. So issues that we hear about related to runoff, carbon, methane, feed sources, so competition for feed sources between livestock. Specifically, we're going to really address grazing livestock today. So competition between humans and livestock for feed sources, some water usage information, and then CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, which historically and traditionally kind of have a negative connotation with them. So we're going to explore each of these issues individually next, but at a very high level, because we just don't have the time today to get in depth, and each of these things could be their own standalone topic. So runoff, and here's the, an aerial view of a water body. One of the things that we know, and we're going to talk about, is that slope of land has an impact on runoff. Vegetative cover has a significant impact on runoff in terms of the quality of the water as it runs off. So generally, the higher the surface cover on ground, the better the soil is protected from raindrop impact, which results in less runoff, less erosion. And when we have less erosion, we have less surface nutrients getting into water bodies. The more dense or more compacted a soil is, the greater the risk that rainwater will run off rather than infiltrate into the soil. And so then we have obviously greater potential for nutrient loss, greater environmental impacts of that. When we talk about grazing later in this presentation, we are going to be talking about grazing under ideal circumstances, ideal best management practices, kind of the current science. So that's not to say that there aren't bad actors or bad instances where grazing is not being done in the proper manner, but we're going to talk today about in ideal circumstances. So again, overgrazing can lead to definite environmental impacts. The highest amount of runoff from agricultural land sometimes can be overgrazed land. So less management intensive grazing usually is where we start to see problems with overgrazing. So when we have what we call set stocking or continuous grazing, where animals are just put on an area of land and are left there for the long term and are not moved. Little bit about water usage, because this is one of the things that is often pointed out, especially with environmentalists or from animal rights groups that are maybe disguised as environmentalists. So what is important to realize is that there are a lot of different numbers out there related to water usage, and some groups use the worst case scenario. You really need to know how those numbers are being calculated, what is being input into them. So there are two different types of water that are talked about a lot of times when we talk about water usage and livestock production. So blue water, which is groundwater or fresh surface water that is used, can be used for irrigation or for human consumption, versus green water. And green water is rainfall that's stored in the soil, can be on the surface, or can also be stored in plants. And so one of the things that we know definitively is that livestock that are grazing fresh plants have a much lower need for drinking water, right? Because so much of fresh plants is water that is stored in plant cells. So UC Davis has a really great environmental, it's called the Clear Center, and they do a lot of work related to livestock production and the environment, whether we're talking about methane, which you're going to see some of their data here later, or we're talking about water usage. And so UC Davis used some of the best and worst case scenarios over all different production types of beef. So that would encompass our CAFOs, it would encompass grass-based livestock production. So it took the whole gamut and came up with a number that they feel reflects typical water usage for a typical piece of beef. And so they come up with 441 gallons of water per pound of beef, versus there's an environmental group out there that is citing 12,009 gallons per pound of beef produced. And so you can see that's a huge, huge range. In typical beef production, UC Davis says that green water is usually about 92% of the total water calculation. So again, that's kind of important to know. So 92% of water that would have fallen either way is whether cattle are there or not, that is about the percentage of water consumed that goes into beef production. Grass pastured beef can actually get up into the 97 to 98% of that green water usage is where their water is coming from. So it can be as low as 50 to 122 gallons of water in grass-based beef production. Beef, the other thing that we need to consider is that beef contains twice as many calories as wheat on a per pound basis. So again, talking again about that kind of power punch that you get from a very nutrient dense food. And just as a point of comparison, a pound of rice requires about 410 gallons of water to produce. Avocados, walnuts, and sugar also have similar water requirements. And so a lot of times we don't get that full picture, right? We just get the finger pointing at livestock. So it's really important to have some kind of understanding of how researchers get their numbers. So here's where a few photos from my Nuffield experiences are going to start coming into play. And I think it's CAFOs are concentrated animal feeding operations. So these are required to be permitted in the United States and to have plans for nutrient management. The majority, what's really important to understand is the majority of a beef animal's life in the United States, regardless of whether they are grain or grass finished, will be spent on grass consuming forages, so whole plants, right? Beef cattle only come if they're going to go into a concentrated animal feeding operation or a feedlot. this is only represents a very small portion of their life that is spent here. They are come from cow-calf operations, so those are maintained on grass or on forages because that's the most affordable way to raise cow-calf pairs. And those cattle, once they are weaned, those calves are backgrounded on forage too before they come to a feedlot like this. And this feedlot was a small family-owned feedlot, actually in Alberta, Canada, that I visited. They had 500 plus acres that was devoted to pasture and forage to background cattle on before they ever came to this feedlot. And their capacity was about 5,000 head, run by a woman. It was a really, really nice operation, complete with grazing charts and all kinds of neat environmental. There definitely were early adopters of the regenerative grazing ideas that we're going to talk about here later. So just a little bit about methane, and this is a little bit of a dangerous topic for an animal scientist to get into, but one that is important to point out, and the difference between the biogenic carbon cycle and methane that is coming from, or carbon that is coming from other sources like fossil fuels. So I think we all know that methane is a potent greenhouse gas, and it does have a warming potential for the globe of 28 times that of carbon dioxide. But when it comes to livestock and climate change, there are other things that make this biogenic methane a little bit different, in my opinion, from straight carbon dioxide. So here's some things that you should be aware of. Methane is what is called a flow gas. So it doesn't stay as methane forever. It has a life in our atmosphere of about 12 years. So it's part of this cycle. So, and you'll see in a minute, but carbon from fossil fuels is a dead end, right? It doesn't cycle into something else. Carbon in this biogenic methane cycle, we know that carbon is stored as carbohydrates in plants, right? Our cattle consume that carbon when they graze, or our ruminants, our sheep and goats fall under that category as well. What happens is a byproduct of ruminant digestion is indeed methane, which contains carbon. So really, more so than anything else, you always hear about cow farts, right? But it's really more the belching, the cow burping, that releases more methane than anything else. So that cow, as she digests, she releases methane gas and burps. That methane, after 12 years, remember I said it's a flow gas, so it doesn't stay as methane forever. It is converted back to CO2. That CO2 is then through the process of photosynthesis is captured again by plants and can be put back into the soil, or can again become a source of nutrition for our cattle. And so really that is a very cyclic, you can see, cycle. That so if our cattle populations are stable, the theory is that, and the data shows, that methane is not actually increasing in the environment from these ruminant sources. Okay, and this diagram did come from the UC Davis Clear Center. So again, methane, 12-year life in the atmosphere, compared to hundreds or even thousands of years that carbon dioxide that comes from fossil fuels that used to be underground do not get recycled. They're just an end product. So methane is considered a short-lived climate pollutant. And so the warming impact of methane isn't determined necessarily by how much is being emitted, since it's being destroyed, but more or less how much is being emitted over a long period of time. So it's possible that you can actually come to an equilibrium with this methane. So one other important point to note that a recent FAO climate report notes that cattle in the US, which tend to have access to better forages, generate notably lower emissions than those in other parts of the globe. So the quality of the forage that we're providing to our animals also impacts emissions, methane emissions. So we can cut methane emissions when cattle are regularly rotated onto fresh pastures. And that is some data that was also shown by the University of Louisiana. So here is a slide that shows how methane claims against cattle are really overblown. And again, you need to know where organizations are getting their data from. Okay, according to the EPA, all livestock only represent 3.9% of US greenhouse gas emissions, which is far lower than many of the plant-based advocates report. And so a lot of times these plant-based organizations will use the entire food supply chain related to cattle and only use a fraction of the chain related to fossil fuels. In UN's most significant report, Livestock's Long Shadow, they claimed that livestock were responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. But again, this figure calculated emissions along the entire supply chain from land use to processing and refrigeration in supermarkets. And in the meantime, transportation figures, which are regularly reported as 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions, only factor in the direct emissions from exhaust fumes, ignoring the processes associated with manufacturing machinery or moving people and produce. So again, you need to know where these figures are coming from. And they're not always easy to get to the bottom of. So again, carbon from fossil fuels is not cyclic. And really, it's my belief and my opinion that unless we get our fossil fuel consumption under control, we will never get a handle on greenhouse gases and global warming. So a little bit about the argument for competition for feed sources. It's important to realize that grazing livestock digest cellulose, and those compounds are undigestible to humans. So sometimes you hear a little bit about the corn argument, but depending on the region of the country and the availability and price of different feeds, corn grain could make up as much as 60 to 80% of a finishing beef animal's diet. So that's those cattle traditionally that are in a feedlot, right? Corn grain is usually a higher proportion of their diet versus these cow-calf operations and these stocker backgrounding operations. The other 15 to 40% of their diet is going to come from forages or roughages. So things like hay, grass, and other plant products. They can also come some from byproducts like distillers' grains that are not digestible or usable for humans. So there are some human edible inputs on these feedlot cattle diets, but you can see from this diagram that feedlot or finishing phase is only 4 to 6 months of an entire beef animal's life. Most beef cattle are harvested or go to slaughter at 18 to 22 months of life, depending on the market, the breed of cattle, and some other factors. So again, not a huge portion of their lifetime. So if you look at the lifetime feed intake of cattle from birth to death or harvest, corn only accounts for approximately 7% of the animal's diet, and the other 93% is going to come largely from feedstuffs that are not edible for humans. So they're not in direct competition with human food sources. And finally, let's get to the part that I really like talking about, which is the grazing part. And this is a photograph taken at home 2 summers ago. We didn't have enough mouths to harvest the grass we were growing. And I was out there mowing one afternoon, and I did one round around the fence line and shut the tractor off and thought, why in the world am I spending my time, my fossil fuel to mow this grass when I just need more mouths to eat it, right? And so called a friend that dairy farms in Harrington near us and said, hey, you don't have any heifers that you need grazed right now, do you? And he said, as a matter of fact, I do. And he sent us 5 or 6 replacement dairy heifers to graze for the summer. So then all we had to do was go move cattle and not be using up fuel and engine hours on the tractor and all of that. And so this was our summer with dairy cattle, which is not something, I mean, I've worked on dairy operations, but not something we traditionally raise. But the really important thing to realize is that grazing typically uses more marginal land that is not well suited for crop production and plants that humans are incapable of consuming, right? So 60% of the world's agricultural land is actually grazing land. It's stony land. It might be land that the soil type isn't good for growing other cash crops. The aspect or the slope of it might be too steep from farming. And so removing cattle doesn't necessarily mean that we will free up more land for crop production. And these cattle are upcycling products, cellulosic products that we can't eat into a higher level, higher quality product that we can. So it's, in my mind, the best kind of recycling that there is. And they contribute to food security. So in this section, it's important to point out that I'm going to be speaking of intensively managed adaptive grazing using best management practices, not this continuous grazing where we put animals in a set area and we just leave them. So in this adaptive or regenerative minded, holistic management, whatever term you want to use, we are stocking animals more densely, but we are moving them very, very quickly. So the time that they are spent on they spend on a single bit of land is pretty rapid. The animal grazes the plant and then moves on to a new area, and the plants are allowed a longer recovery time. And the idea is that this mimics what occurred when our large herbivores roamed the earth. So think about when there were hundreds of thousands, millions of bison in the Midwest, large herds. So this gets to the point of it's not the cow, but it's the how it's done, how it's managed. And one thing that I've come to realize over my career, which I was trained really more as an animal, I would call it an animal biologist. And throughout my career and my professional development experiences and my travel, I've learned a lot more about a systems-based approach. So how the animal fits into the environment with the plants and the whole farm view. And part of this is Nuffield. Part of this that I neglected to mention initially is I've spent a lot of time in New Zealand, and they are probably the most efficient producers of livestock products in pasture-based systems. And that's just been through an opportunity that I've had to teach an animal science department study abroad program. So one thing I've come to realize is overgrazing is not the result of stocking density, which is kind of the traditional view, right? You overgraze because you have too many animals. It's really the duration of the grazing. How long are those animals in the same place? If I had 50 cows in this area that you see here, and I moved them every 2 hours, they wouldn't be overgrazed. But if I left them there for a longer period of time, they would definitely do some environmental damage. The type of disturbances by grazing ruminants is like those our ecosystems experience for millions of years versus the contrast of plowing land for cultivation of crops, which we all know once we start disturbing soil, we release carbon into the atmosphere. The University of Maryland actually did a grazing impact study in 2014 that kind of looked at how grazing animals are essential to properly functioning ecosystems. So they did field tests on 6 continents. They created various test plots that either allowed or excluded grazing because they wanted to be able to identify the effects of grazing livestock. The data showed that they consistently found greater plant diversity flourishing where animals were allowed to graze compared to plots where animals were either excluded or animals were grazed very lightly. And they figure that animals grazing allowed more sunlight to reach the ground, so more diverse plants were allowed or able to grow. In a few slides, you'll see some photos of a trip that I made to British Columbia related to my Nuffield scholarship, visiting Dr. Christoph Wieder, who is a fellow scholar, but he's also a beef and bison producer and a ruminant nutritionist. And he refers to cattle as a 4-wheel drive, solar-powered forage biodigester. So they're pretty unique. They're pretty cool. I will say that originally my plan from college, university undergrad, was to go on to graduate school in ruminant nutrition. But life happens and plans change, but it's still a very much an interest of mine. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of these benefits of adaptive intensive grazing. So we're keeping the soil covered. We're increasing the water holding capacity of our soils. And again, these are under ideal circumstances. Increased water infiltration rates. We're going to talk a little bit about ecosystem services, and that's becoming a much hotter topic. Buzzword, the buzzword for a while was sustainability. Now the buzzwords are ecosystem services, biodiversity, and regenerative are the words that we're hearing more and more of. Increased resilience in the system, because we know that diversity increases resilience. And we're going to talk a little bit about animal health benefits, which is something that I didn't anticipate necessarily when I started my Nuffield project, but has definitely come to the forefront of my mind also, as well as, being an animal biologist type of person. So we know that keeping the soil covered helps prevent erosion. One of the things that blew my mind that I came across during my Nuffield is that when you think about the loss of soil, the thickness of a sheet of paper, all right? So if we lost soil across an acre, the thickness of a sheet of paper, how much soil do you think that is in terms of tons? That is actually 1 ton of soil. And so by keeping soil covered, we are minimizing erosion. One of the other great benefits of keeping soil covered is that we have a lower soil temperature. We have extreme differences, and this has been documented by a number of researchers. So by keeping soil temperatures cooler, it's a more habitable environment for soil microbes. And we're really starting to pay more attention to what's going on below the soil surface in that root zone of the plant versus we used to always largely, especially from the animal grazing perspective, only be concerned about what was going on above that surface. Soil pores are the tiny holes that are created in between soil particles, and that is where soil is degraded. That is where water and air can infiltrate our soils. So when soil is degraded, when it's overgrazed or it's compacted, those pores are lost, they're collapsed. And then we start to see problems with water infiltration and greater surface runoff. This is actually what happens when we till soils as well. And so that is why the no-till movement is so critical to agricultural sustainability. Every time we run any kind of tillage equipment through soil, we are destroying soil structure and habitat. We're going to talk about how diversity increases greater resilience, whether we're discussing this from an ecological perspective or an economic perspective, right? We have long recognized that diversification is a recognized risk management strategy in agricultural operations. and building that diversity into our system biologically as well is critical to risk management. So here's one of the benefits that we know from this adaptive, intensively managed grazing: increased water infiltration and water holding capacity. So again, we're preserving those soil pores, we're improving soil structure, and we have much, much higher water infiltration rates. This is a photograph of Alex Brewster, who is a farmer and a former Nuffield Scholar in Scotland that I visited at Rotmel Farms, and he runs a business now called Powered Pastures. And so not only on his own farm is Alex implemented these regenerative strategies, but now he's serving as an advisor to other farmers and also selling some of the equipment that is needed when we do intensive rotational grazing. So here we were out on his farm, and we literally just took a spade in different places and dug through the soil profile to look at soil structure, to look at porosity, to look at a lot of the macro life forms that were in the soil. And you'll find that you have a lot more macro life forms in soil that has good soil structure versus soil that has been degraded or the structure has been damaged or collapsed. We know that we have the ability to sequester carbon in these really well-managed grazing systems better than any other way, including the planting of trees. Planting of trees, while that offers kind of a band-aid, it sequesters carbon very rapidly initially. The first few years that a tree is planted, once a tree hits about 15 to 20 years, it doesn't sequester carbon much at that point. Oh, there's lots of examples of studies that have been done by land-grant universities throughout the US. Idaho State University compared land management strategies using 3 different approaches: total rest, holistic planned grazing, which is this regenerative sort of model, and then rest rotation, which is a lighter stock density. They measured soil water content continuously for 2 years using 36 different sensors. And they found that the ground covered by plant litter was the highest in terms of soil water content, and that using that planned mob grazing. So management decisions, grazing, rest periods have substantial impacts on soil water content and the impact of and duration of grazing. So again, really, there's a lot of data out there, but you have to kind of collect it. It's scattered. So what does this planned holistic grazing or regenerative grazing look like? Typically, we have multiple paddocks. They're pretty small, but it also depends on the size of the mobs that you're running. So here's just a couple of photographs from home. This is on the right. What you're seeing is a mob of Katahdin sheep. These were some sheep that I was grazing for a retired University of Maryland extension agent. He didn't have enough space at home, and he asked me if I would take them. These ewes were destined to be recipient ewes, actually, for embryo transfer of sort of high-end seed stock genetics. So these ewes were brought in. They were pasture bred at my place in October and November. They lambed on pasture. They were wintered over on pasture. They lambed on pasture in April. And then once the lambs were weaned, the ewes were prepped to receive embryos from high-end blackface type sheep. But what we're talking about is growing a substantial amount of forage, so longer rest periods. You can see here on the left, you've got this longer forage. This was actually, you can see in the background, cropland this is December. So this is stockpiled forage. On the right, you see a paddock that sheep have just come out of, so you can really see the effects of their grazing and trampling. And on the left, this is the paddock that they were getting ready to go into. And I don't think I put the photo in here, but there's another photo that I took that day of my husband standing there with that forage standing up. He actually stood the grass up, and it was halfway between his knee and his hip, and he's 6'4", so he's pretty tall. So there was a lot of forage in this paddock. But these animals are only here for a day, maybe two. So you're constantly having to evaluate what kind of forage is out there and when animals need to be moved. So Texas A&M has done some studies looking at the wide-ranging benefits of mob grazing. So less bare ground, more soil aggregation, a lot of the same things that we've already talked about. Soil that's more penetrable by water, lower sediment loss, higher soil organic matter. So what's the importance of soil organic matter? Soil organic matter directly correlates to water holding capacity. So for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, that represents an additional 20,000 gallons of water per acre that can be held in that soil. And so that's really important, right? We talk about irrigation here all the time as a risk management strategy, but what about building your soil organic matter as that reservoir of water? And so nutrient availability is also greater in these systems because they're cycling biologically the way they should. This study that Texas A&M did documents positive results for long-term maintenance of resources and economic viability by ranchers who use this adaptive management and mob grazing. North Dakota State has looked at effects of grazing management treatments on rangeland vegetation. So properly timed cattle grazing can increase vegetation by as much as 45%. And their study determined that grazing of large herbivores is essential, again, for well-functioning prairie ecosystems. Whoops, got ahead of myself here. So again, you can't tell, and you can't even see the fence here. You can see the permanent fence, but you can't see the electric fence that is here. But there are 30 sheep in that paddock. There is so much vegetation here. And I think one of the things that I had to become comfortable with is in this regenerative, holistic sort of model, or how it's carried out, things might not look as neat and tidy as we think, right? Because you can see the biodiversity here in this photo, and we'll look at some more closer images here. But these sheep, there are 30 of them in this photo, and they are busy grazing. These animals very quickly learn that every time they move, it's fresh food. And so literally they will stand there when they see you come, you open the electric fence, and they rush into the next grazing cell. And all you can hear is biting and chewing, heads are down. So this mob mentality actually forces our animals to graze more uniformly and be less selective about the plants that they choose to eat as well. Here's another photo from, again, on my Nuffield. This is in Ireland. I had a chance to meet with this gentleman here on the right named Robbie Byrne, who works for Cotswold Seeds. He's also a farmer as well. So in Ireland, they refer to multi-species grazing. When we're talking about multi-species, in this case, we're talking about different types of plant species. But Cotswold Seed was kind of on the cutting edge in terms of what they call herbal leys, L-E-Y-S, which is their version of multi-species grazing, using lots of different types of plants. So we're using not only grasses, but we're using legumes and forbs and all kinds of plants that have different root depths into the soil. And so provide different carbon compounds at different levels throughout the soil profile for soil life, so the microbes that live in the soil. Their research showed that we actually get higher yields, higher production out of our forages when they are in multiple species versus single species stands. So that's sort of the yield. Here's their little promotional brochure, but yielding 50% more than their average. And so this is a great discussion. And then we went out and started walking through fields and looking. And here's just some photos from home over the last 2 summers of grazing seasons, looking at some biodiversity. So a number of studies have recorded higher biodiversity in grazed relative to ungrazed systems. And so here you can see you've got legumes here in vetch, in clover. We've got some brassicas that are flowering. We've got lots of grasses. And this is prior to animals entering this grazing cell. So at home, I've been doing a lot with interseeding some annual forage species into some grass stands. So experimenting with how best to do that, what kind of equipment, what kind of timing, what seed mixes. And I am not a researcher, but it's been fun to play around with this at home and see. Here's another image. One of the benefits of this has been great pollinator habitat. You can see these are 2 different types of legumes. We've got a clover that's flowering in the background and a vetch. We do have some buttercups here, but you will find that while buttercups are viewed typically by livestock grazers as something undesirable, it does have its place, especially if it's in minimal quantities. And what I have found is the more we encourage these beneficial forage species of different types, the less we see buttercups. Buttercups are really a result of overgrazing for the most part. We keep 8 beehives on our farm as well. And so certainly we see a lot of benefit in our honey production by having all of these different types of flowering plants in our pastures now as well. And while I haven't done counts or formal data, just the insect and bird life increase and butterflies, the number of butterflies and how early we see them in the season now versus when we were grazing just a typical tall fescue plain old pasture is really significant. And it's been a joy to really see. And now we're starting to look at ways to encourage more bird life and putting more bird houses in and things like that. Here's another place that I visited as part of my Nuffield. This is the Venator Ranch in Hudson's Hope, and this is northeast British Columbia, Canada. 35,000 acres, raising bison and cattle. This is again Christoph's place. Christoph is the one that talked about the 4-wheel biodigesters. So they bought this ranch in 2012 or 2013 and have been regenerating it ever since. So this ranch was used for hay production for 30 plus years. So the hay, there were no grazing livestock on the 35,000 acres. So hay was exported from there. And so exporting hay represents nutrient loss, right? We're shipping nutrients off of the property in the form of hay. And here was a really great example. We spent 3 days exploring this place by plane and by land cruiser. So here's a great example of a hayfield that they hadn't regenerated yet versus a pasture that had legumes added to it as well as grazing cattle on it. And I think there's a pretty distinct difference that you can see there in terms of biodiversity. And just a fun little photo when we were out visiting cattle and bison, someone had to come explore the truck. So we kind of had to step away, but interesting, fascinating place where we saw animals like moose and bears cohabitating with cattle and bison. Here's another place, the UCD, so the University College of Dublin in Ireland, the Lions Research Farm Smart Sward or Smart Grass project. So this was a project that had been undertaken for a number of years there in Ireland, where they ultimately showed that multi-species swards can yield as much good quality herbage as perennial ryegrass, which traditionally Irish agriculture, cattle production, whether we're talking dairy or beef, has focused around monoculture crops of perennial ryegrass, which require a lot of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So this demonstration was really fascinating because they had 4 different pasture compositions here, and they are actually measuring runoff. So you can see in this left photo, you have some gravel, and underneath that gravel was perforated pipe. And so they would collect what was running off out of these tubes here on the right and measure sediment, measure nutrient content, all of that. And so these multi-species swards were requiring less than half of the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that a monoculture crop of perennial ryegrass would require. And so this reduced dependence on nitrogen fertilizer decreases the likelihood that nitrogen would be lost to the surrounding environment, whether that's through leaching or for runoff. And they modeled estimates of emissions of the potential for greenhouse gas emissions. So what they found is that emissions were reduced up to 90% compared with straight grass swards. Animals' performance was better on these multi-species swards. The animals were growing at a more rapid rate, and they were healthier. They reached their target slaughter weights about 2 weeks earlier. And then one of the big issues that we have from an animal health perspective, especially with small ruminants, is internal parasites. Internal parasites have become largely resistant to a lot of the synthetic dewormer chemicals that we have to use. And so one of the strategies, in addition to genetics, is that multi-species sward grazing is really having an impact on parasitic worms. So animals will have about 50% less. They'll require about 50% less treatments than animals grazing on straight grass pastures, or especially animals that are overgrazed and forced to graze more closely to the soil surface. And they saw lots of increase in biodiversity, both above and below ground. So they were looking at soil microbe profiles as well as biodiversity at the macro level, talking about insects and pollinators and things like that. So it was an absolutely fascinating study. Dr. Tommy Boland is the gentleman standing there to my right in that photo. And he said his comment was that soil health is very underrated as a management tool in the livestock sector. One of the neat things that you see as you start to work with animals in these systems is that they have the ability to self-select. And here's another photograph from home. You can see we've got chicory, we've got clovers, we've got grasses, but animals have the ability to self-select what they want to graze. And one thing that I have noticed with my own livestock is that at different times of the year, they will select different things to graze when they first enter a new grazing cell. So for instance, last summer, the first time through this cell, they did not select the chicory. Largely the chicory was left behind. And I thought, okay, what's up with that? Why didn't they want the chicory? I spent this money on putting chicory seed into this paddock. Why are they not grazing it? The next time they came through it, that's what they went for first. And so there is some thought that animals have the ability to self-regulate their own needs for minerals and other nutritional components, and they are self-selecting based on those needs. And so when we're offering them a variety of plants, we give them that ability to self-select the choice. Now, let's talk a little bit, we're getting to the end here, the challenges and opportunities with these systems, right? So one of the biggest challenges is the anti-meat and environmental movements. Activists, these two groups are often hand in hand. And in my opinion, they use selective data to support their positions. So a lot of times these anti-animal ag groups are disguised as environmentalists. So for instance, these groups often decree how much crop production goes into the feeding of animals, yet they don't talk about that when it comes to plant-based meat or meat alternatives. One of the big challenges is getting farmers to think differently, right? Our currency really is sunlight, right? That's the source of energy for these plants to raise food, right? So our source is more sunlight than it is fossil fuels. So we're trying to capture as much of it to grow plants and grasses as we can. And then we're integrating livestock into it as the harvest mechanism, right? Instead of harvesting it as hay or grain. Here, especially, the cost of land is definitely a challenge. You know, we've heard in earlier presentations, I think Georgie was the one that mentioned it, how high the cost of land is here in Delaware and Maryland. We're in the top 5 or 6 states in the US. Local processing capacity for meat and meat products. And this is something that was very definitively highlighted during COVID, right? We had shortages in the supply chain of meat from our traditional large processing plants. So you would go to the grocery store and if there was meat, you were limited on the quantity that you could buy. Local processing capacity here is a challenge because the regulations surrounding slaughtering of livestock and building these processing plants is a bit cumbersome and a bit restrictive, and it's a challenging system to navigate. The Delaware Farm Bureau actually undertook a study or survey in the Mid-Atlantic region where they surveyed farmers and asked them about their ability to get their livestock processed. And I know for us, we are having to schedule our cattle out 2 years for local slaughter capacity. So literally, when I have a calf, I call and schedule an appointment for it 2 years down the road to be able to get it in at our local USDA inspected processor. One of the things is also is we've encouraged people to specialize within agriculture, right? So a lot of farmers only grow corn and soybeans, or they only grow vegetables, or they don't want the challenge of managing livestock in their cropping systems. It's another enterprise that has to be managed. It requires a different set of knowledge and skills, but I also think that could potentially be an opportunity for a new service to be provided. I think there are examples other places. I met a potato farmer in Colorado that actually plants a multi-species crop and in between his potato crops and pays someone to come and graze it with their cattle. So that individual brings the cattle to the system. They're the ones responsible for moving the cattle, for setting up the fencing, but he felt like the benefit to his soil and his crops is much greater by having that input of ruminants into the system. And I think consumer understanding of all of these issues is a challenge because most people take what they're told at face value and they don't investigate or question some of the facts. Opportunities, right? Let's talk about the positives. Here on Delmarva, we are really close in proximity to our markets and to a very high population density. This regenerative movement, I think, gives farmers a lot of social license because we can point out the positive impacts of this type of grazing. There's still a lot of discussion about ecosystem services and how to value that. And that was actually a topic explored by some other Nuffield scholars from my cohort. So what is the value of these things that farmers are providing in terms of carbon sequestration, in terms of biodiversity and pollinators? I have a friend in Australia that bought another farm recently, and they are getting koala credits, butterfly credits, carbon credits, and pollinator credits they're actually being paid for from this ecosystem services. And so what does that look like for farmers, 10, 15, 20 years down the road? The impact on animal health, animals, ruminants in particular, this is how they were designed to eat and live. And so they are much healthier in these pasture-based systems You know, we don't have to add sodium bicarbonate to their diets to make sure that their rumens are buffering properly, because this is the way they were made to digest. And of course, right now, the reduced reliance on synthetic inputs. We all know what the cost of fertilizers has done over the last year. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, all have over doubled in cost per pound. So, you know, if we have a way to contribute nutrients in a balanced way through livestock grazing, that really reduces our reliance on synthetic inputs. I didn't mention it earlier, but there's a study that's been cited a number of times by regenerative minded folks, and it looks at how long it takes to cover an acre of ground with a manure patty from a cow. And in a managed, really intensive grazing, like regenerative grazing is, you can cover that entire acre in a year with a manure patty, versus in a continuous grazing model where we're just putting animals out on a large piece of land and leaving them, it can take up to 20 years to cover that acre evenly with a manure patty. And so that manure distribution really helps when it comes to fertilizer and synthetic inputs. We know that carbon stored below ground is more permanent than plant biomass carbon. And so there is opportunity to sequester carbon in grazing lands. And this can be a long-term alternative to mitigate atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. Again, this is under best practice, though, not overgrazing situations. So one of the last things I want to mention is there was a $1 million grant that was given last year in 2021 by Southern SARE, so the Sustainable Agriculture Research Group, to NCAT and Virginia Tech. And they want to explore this whole regenerative grazing model more thoroughly and be able to replicate the Texas study that I mentioned earlier. So they want to identify practical and regionally appropriate methods of regenerative grazing that can be implemented across the Southeast. It's a systems-based approach. So it analyzes the problem as a whole, right? They focus on the whole broad array of factors rather than isolating individual variables. So they're looking at the social, the economic, political, biological components. And it's there's farmer cooperators in this grant. It's an interdisciplinary team of 6 universities, all told, 3 non-NGOs, and 8 farmer cooperators. And so I'm really interested. This is a 3-year grant through 2024. So I'm really interested in following this grant and seeing what kind of outcomes that they have, because that will definitely have some implications for us here as well. And so that brings me back to the original question, which is, are grazing, food production, and the environment mutually exclusive? And I think the answer is a definitive, again, no. And I hope that you think that as well now. And maybe this presentation has probably given you more questions than answers. In the Nuffield world, that is a good thing. That's how things usually are in the Nuffield world, where we end up with more questions at the end than we had to start. But just a lot of food for thought here, I think, and a different way of looking at things.
Susan.
Yes.
You do a good job. I like this presentation. Is it on the future you will do it again?
I could, yes, I think.
Yeah, because I like this presentation. It's really excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was excellent. I learned so much, and you really did a wonderful job of really integrating.
It's a lot.
All aspects, really.
A lot.
So, and covered it in a way where someone like myself could really understand it. So thank you very much. I put in the chat earlier the URL to do the survey. So please take a moment and click on that and help us better understand what you took away from today and what else you might want to learn. And with that, I'm just going to say thank you so much, Susan. That was stupendous.